Whenever you're ready to go.
Great. Well, I hope you've all been enjoying Product Camp. I'm Steve Drew, and I'm going to be leading this session today. Generally, it's about product management and some of the things that you might see from startup to maturity. So in this session, I'm going to be discussing, some of the things that you might see, some of the healthy practices, hopefully, that are used by startups that are really, in my opinion, out of necessity, just because of what a startup is. And many of those are advantageous not just to the startup, but also to a more maturing product or company. And I'll probably use the two interchangeably. So there are also some lead indicators that you might see that could represent some pitfalls that result in some practices that can develop as the company matures. And I'm going to talk about some of those slippery slopes and how they can stifle innovation. They could erode some of the culture that you might have, or potentially even jeopardize your company's survival. I'll give you some tricks and tips to deal with those. So let's, I want to give kind of a bit of a disclaimer first, because a session like this isn't for everyone. And so first and foremost, I'm really talking to companies that have some level of resource constraints. So you have capital constraints, people constraints, and time. So you don't have an infinite budget is basically what it is, and you have those constraints. I'm also really talking to product companies that don't require initial perfection. So I'm not talking about building airplanes and ventilators and microprocessors even, because the cost of a mistake is really high. People can die, you can lose lots of money, your going concern can be jeopardized, and so forth. I'm really talking today to software product managers that live in this iterative world and can deal with more of an agile approach. So before we jump in, who am I? What have I been doing? Why am I leading the session? So I've spent the last 25 years in fintech software, in product management, and various levels of leadership and contributor roles and so forth. In the last 6 years ago, I joined Darren Powderly and Tor Steen and Ian Fermigli as one of the founding team members of CrowdStreet. And Darren was running sales, and Tor was our CEO and is our CEO. Ian was running investments and investor relations. And I ran product and engineering and services and marketing. And yes, as you know, in a startup, you wear a lot of different hats and so forth. So over the years, I've built those different departments. I've passed them off to different leaders. And I'm now taking a more holistic, strategic role, which looks across the company at ways that we can grow in general and how we can scale and so forth. So I've been leading these teams. I've been a contributor and so forth. In a prior life, I've done marketing research at a research firm. I've led line extensions for accounting products at Sage and at other companies. I've worked at building out ERP suites and creating new accounting solutions and really defining and launching many solutions included in the point of sale space at Radiant Systems. So lots of work over the last 25 years. But enough about me. Let's talk about what we're going to go through today. So I have 6 topics today that I'd love to try and get through if I can. I'm going to breeze through this pretty fast. And here's what I'd like to try and cover. So first are 2 what I would call natural laws of product management that I've come across in my years. Second would be the startup trade-off. So what do you need to do as a startup and those trade-offs you have to make? I call it Bullseye prioritization. We'll talk about that a little bit further. Planning with swagger, Innovator's dilemma, and yes, I'm referencing Clayton Christensen if you've read his book, and a parable that I've created over the years, and I'd like to share it with you, that I call the inadequacy bridge. So let's jump into it first. So first, as I said, this is my take on what I've seen over the years about things that to me feel like natural laws of product management. And you may disagree, that's fine. It's just what I've seen and how I make sense of this crazy role, this crazy job that we play as product managers. So the first, what I would call natural law, is that velocity and predictability are inversely correlated, and with a caveat. So that is, unless quality and accuracy don't matter. And so why do I even start here? And it's really because I feel so strongly that you have to acknowledge that there is this trade-off that happens. When you want to run fast, you're doing it despite predictability and despite precision about that predictability. You're running fast. If you want to be predictable, it takes effort to be predictable. So let's kind of decompose that a bit. And what do I mean? As I said, really the time spent predicting the future must impact your ability to run fast, and spending time thinking about the future does detract from your ability to run fast, and that's fine. It's just a reality. Also, the fact that information that's needed to predict the future is always, or really it should always, exceed what you have when you're trying to predict. Or you're really running what's called a waterfall approach, or basically front loading all of your analysis, which basically stops you from getting moving. So getting all that, you always have less information than you need to make good decisions. And there's this balance between the two counterforces that's just needed. And so my first word of caution is, a focus on precision can be a cultural sign of distrust. And we'll talk about what I mean by that later. But in the startup world, you're often focusing on running fast. And I'll go through that first. But the first rule is that the two are inversely correlated. The second law that I've found is that fixing scope and time and quality will eventually destroy culture. And it really, said another way, you have to allow teams to have wiggle room. And if there is no wiggle room between defining scope and setting targets and quality, you're going to have problems. And really the caveat there is that, yeah, that's true, unless your culture allows for some level of sandbagging in your estimates and your predictions, and it's just kind of baked into the way you do things. In other words, your time predictions are somewhat fabricated, or you have a product that really promotes some level of martyrdom. And if you think about going to the moon, or curing cancer, or developing a vaccine, you have people that are investing incredible effort to get there. But it's because what I call the three-legged stool is fixed. And in this three-legged stool, you have these three different attributes: your scope and your time and your quality. And we really have, as product managers, we have to be able to wiggle some of those. We have to control the scope and the time and quality and so forth. If we don't, what will happen is we'll choose to cut corners, which can impact quality. We'll go long because there's more scope than we can possibly complete in the time, or we just trim scope. So these are, again, it's just a natural law, and I'll get to why that's relevant in a second. And so again, what do I mean? When is always a function of how much or at what level of quality. And that really something has to give and flex. So product management departments need that ability to flex, or ultimately people will have to absorb that disconnect between these three legs of the stool. And if they are fixed, then you get these Herculean efforts that burn people out. So as leaders, we need to be very aware of the effect that our culture can have on people. And we can offset that by having rewards and recognition and creating pride of work for what you do. But ultimately, we have to give teams the ability to make these trade-off decisions, or that rigidity creates a fear of failure, and so forth. So I'm bounding this conversation on those two rules. So these natural rules, as I view them, really set the frame for a conversation that I'd like to have in this session, that's about bounding the trade-offs that really we have to make as product managers. And so let's start off with the first, as a startup. And what I'm going to try and do is correlate the things that happen to startups, or that we do as startups, and how they manifest themselves later in maturing companies, and what we can learn from that. So first, there's just a reality. As a startup, this is nothing new. If we don't run fast, we don't survive, period. That's just all there is to it. That is the nature of being a startup. You have to move fast. If you don't, you run out of cash, your opportunity evaporates, you have a competitor that swoops in and wins the space. So the startup has to absolutely run fast. And these trade-offs force us to make decisions and trade-offs about really velocity versus predictability, which I already mentioned, and then function over form. And if you think about function over form, think about if you've seen the movie Social Dilemma, and you have Mark Zuckerberg, who's building the Facebook and basically just cranking all night long and creating this product. He is trying to run as fast as he can to feverishly get to an MVP, a minimum viable product. And he's doing that by cutting corners, possibly doing things that aren't the way he wants to do it in the future. And he's running fast, not predicting when he's going to get there. He just wants to get there as fast as he can. And so if you think about that in terms of a matrix, startups must begin by running fast. And so for a startup, you start in the lower left quadrant. And this is where you are absolutely running to build the product, the core product that runs your business. And you're doing it not based on how great you can predict when you get there, but how fast you can get there. So startups all by nature are in the bottom corner. And this is really done because startups are seeking to evolve, and I'll reference Dino Vendetti, who's our chairman of the board, who shared this slide with me some time ago. I think it's a great framework. As you're thinking about a startup and how a startup is evolving, you're trying to evolve quickly from a minimum viable product to what he calls, and maybe it's in academic reading that I haven't seen, a minimum viable traction, which is really saying that your business is viable, it's generating cash, and it's poised to scale and to grow. So ultimately, we're trying to scale. And if you think about a startup in these different quadrants or these different sections, you're running in this capital efficient space where you need to save money, you don't have enough people, and you're moving really quickly. Your minimum viable product is often something that's not truly usable. It just has enough to demonstrate that you have a real business so that you can drive your seed round and your A round and your B round, get the funding to grow to get to your real product. So the point is that you're running really fast to build up this product, and you're doing it with limited resources. So when you're running fast, and we're making these form over function trade-offs, we can think about function as really solving for your ability to. So as product managers, we will often frame things in terms of the ability to do something, and that's your requirement. But it's addressing these table stakes that you need to have a viable product, to get to an MVP, and so forth. And when you have a function orientation for your company, your target is early adopters. They're experienced users. They are tinkerers. They're motivated by playing and learning and so forth. So they're very comfortable living in that state of flux. And your measurement is really about, does this thing work? Can the user complete the necessary task? Which is very different from a form-based focus for a company, which often happens more in maturity. You try and add some of this as you go, but a form-based company, from my perspective, is really focusing more on the experience. So it's not that it just has to accomplish the objective, it has to do it in a way that is very usable, has a great user experience, has a great workflow. You have other ability twos that are more around performance and concurrency and scalability. So if you have something that can accomplish an objective, but it's really slow, it's really not fully meeting the need, but that's on the form side. So the target for a form-based company is one that's really focusing on the mass market, the inexperienced user. They have a low tolerance for learning. They expect the product to be intuitive. They expect it to function well and fast, and things be where they should be. So the measurement for these types of products are really, how does the user rate the experience? So customer satisfaction and net promoter score and so forth. Or you could look at it from a conversion perspective. How effectively do we convert a user to do something within our product? Have we maximized or optimized that conversion rate? So again, this is another framework for thinking about these trade-offs. Am I focusing on function? Am I focusing on form? Have I blended the two together? So if you think about how when a startup is going to maturity, what's really happening is you're evolving from this lower left quadrant of high velocity and high function, filling table stakes as quickly as you can, to really trying to have a blend between function and form. As you're maturing by nature, you have less functionality to build, i.e. you're maturing, but you need to deliver form with that function. And so to some extent, the movement towards a form-based focus, it actually can accelerate your velocity because you have an established paradigm for your UI, but it can also slow down your velocity because you are thinking more about how to deliver the optimal experience, how to solve for a robust experience and so forth. So finding that right balance between form and function is really part of that startup to maturity growth and thinking about those while retaining velocity. And we have to be careful as product managers that we maintain velocity, and we'll get into that in just a second. So a few takeaways from this. So, unlike startups who really have no choice in most cases, again, if you're a constrained company, which was my qualifier for the discussion, you must run fast. You don't have infinite resources. You can't hire hundreds of people, and you don't have infinite time. Maturing products do gain a bit of a luxury in that they're able to start choosing between this form and function trade-off and this velocity and predictability trade-off. But the trade-off always persists. So the maturing company needs to think about that trade-off, where the startup company really is just doing what they have to do. The point of having to think about it and having this choice is you've got to solve it, and it's part of your strategy. So you need to seek ways, in my opinion, that encourage retaining some of that startup juice that allows you to move fast. And you can do that by encouraging experimentation, iterative refinement, and rapid development. And you can even do this, and I get it with larger companies, you can't release some of these early iterations to the public, but you can certainly drive that as internal releases to get that velocity and get that focus on iterative development. The second is really to focus on rewards through demos, because demos ultimately mean that you are building real code, and that means you are moving fast and you're encouraging forward progress. And I stress here that forward progress is a zigzag, and you will have stumbles, but it's just part of accepting that, which startups get, and maturing companies need to remember that. So I would say that you also need to strive for slight misses to real problems that can be solved very quickly. And that's different than saying that any problem is acceptable. You need to try to avoid the biggest problems, which to me are a problem alignment problem, where you are literally solving the wrong problem, or you're solving problems that just really don't matter or your customer won't pay for. So the maturing company has got to think about that as they're making some of these trade-offs. So really that comes to prioritization. Okay, great. So how do startups, when you're trying to run fast, make these trade-offs and run fast? Because you have limited time, you're trying to go quickly and so forth. And so I refer to this as Bullseye prioritization, and it's a model that I've used over the years that works great for me. And in Bullseye prioritization, what we're really talking about is finding bullseye customers that represent your market segment, so that you can solve for their needs and know that you're solving for a larger market need. So the trick is really to find 2 to 3 Bullseye customers that are go-to-market customers that meet a couple criteria. And the criteria is really important because if you pick the wrong customers, they're going to take you sideways. So first, they really have to have needs and problems that are representative of your larger market segment. So you have to understand what you're trying to solve for and what your market looks like so that you can select a Bullseye customer that aligns well with it. They need to care about your success. If they don't care about your success, they're not going to invest the time. And if they don't invest the time, you don't get the input that you need. They have to be able to engage and so forth. There needs to be able to a willingness also, that means to work through some of these issues that will come up and get to this end state. So they're patient and persistent. You also need to solve for the biggest needs and pains that come out of these discussions. And you need to use your Bullseye customers to use the product and to pay for it. So if your Bullseye customers don't actually use something or don't say they'll use it, or they don't say they'll pay for it, then you're misguided, because ultimately most of you are probably running for-profit businesses, and paying for that solution is really part of the objective. So I always have had regular meetings with my Bullseye customers. I have them on speed dial, and I'm vetting my assumptions with them actively. It's the only way to move fast. You don't have to go to the market. You go to your few Bullseye customers. You need to listen quickly, learn, vet their solutions, and ultimately you're doing what they say. That's the trade-off. You're taking their input and you're really doing it. You're building a product for them. And the point ultimately here is to save time, because what you believe, or you have hopefully justified, is that by solving the specific needs of the Bullseye, you're solving the needs of the larger market segment. So, how can this concept be applied to maturing products and companies and so forth? Well, first, of course, hopefully when you were a younger maturing company, an early company, you have these Bullseye customers and you can retain them. So that's the first thing that I would strongly recommend. Second is, you've got to reevaluate your Bullseyes as you mature, because your market will probably mature as well. So be careful not to assume that your Bullseye customers will last through the life of the company or the product. You need to constantly refocus your Bullseye customers to your specific strategic objective, and expand into new customers and so forth to do that. So another approach that you can certainly use as a maturing company, because you now have more customers, is to build a customer advisory board. But I'd be careful with that. There are definitely pros of having a customer advisory board if you can keep it very small and very intimate. If it gets too large, it gets out of control. Also, when you get members on a customer advisory board, I've made this mistake myself. You don't want just the most vocal or most influential to be on your board. They may, in fact, skew the opinions of others. So you have to think about how they'll play together with others, and make sure that there's a collaborative focus within the group. But as I mentioned, be careful, because a cab is a very different animal than a Bullseye customer, because the Bullseye customer is trying to help you get to the end state. And generally, an existing customer that's on a cab has very specific maintenance needs that could be different than what your strategic objectives are. And they're going to be very vocal about that. So here are the Bullseye customers that I've used over the years. I thought it would be interesting just to throw these up in the different market segments. So you'll note some very large companies that have brand rec that you would know, other smaller ones that I've used throughout the years. And the range of involvement with these companies has varied. Some like Mapco, for example, was a quick service, or I'm sorry, it's a petroleum and convenience store that was starting up a deli inside, and we had a point of sale that we were creating. And I spent days there trying to get this first implementation installed. Yum Brands, we were building their point of sale. Chick-fil-A was also a point of sale. BP Amico's, I was less involved in this, but had some relationship. If you've ever seen videos at the pump, Radiant System built many of those in the past. Zimbrick, I built marketing research studies around them. Hamilton-Zans is at Crowd Street, and Regal Cinemas, if you've used the purchase your own tickets and so forth. These are all companies. Denholtz, I probably had the close relationship with. I literally had a weekly call with them as I was building out Crowd Street for probably a year and a half. Very vocal, very outspoken person that clearly hit my bullseye. And so by building for her needs, I was able to really cut down on a lot of the large market research that was needed, as well as working with some of the other early adopters like Hamilton-Zans and so forth, and KBS. So my point here is these are my bullseyes. As product managers, you got to go get your own. So planning with swagger, to me, yes, swagger is what you'd think. A swag, we'll get to that in a second, but so it's great to have bullseye customers. That's all well and good, but at some point, there will certainly be more things that are requested by your customers, by your bullseyes even, than you can possibly do. And you need to have some mechanism that allows you to decide what to build when. And I call this planning with swagger. And it certainly can apply not just to startups, but it's to all maturing companies. And so, there's always more to do. And how do startups choose this? Well, first thing, startups can take shortcuts when they're planning, and they can do that by working with these bullseye customers. But really, a swag, or as you know, swag is a super wild ass guess, and it is exactly that. It is a wild ass guess around when you think something can be done based on a lack of very much information at all. So startups generally depend on swags not so much as part of a formal process, but a way of, when you need to quickly sequence work, when everything is important, which is definitely the common response that you might get. How do you do that? Well, when you're running fast and you have Mark Zuckerberg building out Facebook, he didn't sit in a room with a bunch of engineers and try and estimate how long it was going to take to do that. He used his gut. And with his gut, he's trying to figure out how to sequence the work. It has nothing to do with predictability. It has nothing to do with a date. It has to do with an opportunity cost trade-off. If I do these types of things now, and I don't do these things, then how will that affect the business, my going concern, my ability to get my A round, my B round, and so forth? It's all about relativity. It's not about dates. And so that's really the purpose of a swag to a startup, to just be part of the framework of thinking about the problem, to say, am I sequencing my work correctly? It's not about predicting dates. You've got to remember that a swag, if done correctly, was done way before you had enough information to have an accurate estimate. So it is what it is. It's a super wild ass guess. It's what your gut told you you think you might be able, how long it might take to deliver something, but it's used to say, if this huge thing provides a lot of value and this small thing provides even more, maybe you should do that in a different order. So it helps you prioritize. And again, it's a focus, should be on velocity, not predictability. It gets back to that vector between the two. If I slow down and I think more about how, when I can do this, I'm not doing the work. So, what's my beef with estimating? Why just stay focused on swags and so forth? Well, I believe that, maturing products can become fixated with predicting delivery dates, and especially as your backlog gets large. And this often happens, as I've seen it, because the backlog has become so large. Product managers, as part of their job, have had to say no so many times that the pressure to build the things that you've said no to have bubbled to a level where you probably have executives that are saying, you need to tell people when this is coming. And that's all well and good. But it creates this pressure to estimate and to come up with dates, which are not relative, they're absolute. And so the dates can actually become misused, and they can be used to create and predict delivery dates, not just to sequence your work, which is part of the run fast model. And this slows down your velocity. it also subtly sows a seed of distrust. Because what it's saying is that the product managers may not be making the right calls, or they may not be working hard enough. And I don't just mean product managers, the entire product team. And it creates this anxiety that you're not running fast enough, not doing the right things, and so forth. It's like a check on you. And if you use it the right way, it's about ensuring you're doing the right things in the right order. So that can actually create, in some cultures, a culture of fear, where this fear of failure actually creates an overcommitment on estimating, or a fear of overcommitting increases your time estimating, because there's this fear that if I miss my date, I'm going to be ridiculed in some way. Well, what does that do? That slows down your velocity. So back to predictability and velocity. If you have to get more information up front to make a better and better decision, you're doing more and more work to uncover what you ultimately need, and you're slowing down. You're probably building the wrong thing too. So this creates this vicious cycle of spending more time on resources and estimates, and that's generally my opinion, that it creates this fear of failure, stagnation, and so forth. So what do you do? How do you live in this model, and what would make sense to kind of function like a startup does, but also continue that as a maturing company? Well, I would recommend using SWAGs as an informed gut check, that the right opportunity costs, the right opportunity trade-offs are being made, and it's part of a framework of a conversation, a trade-off conversation. And the word I'd like to stress is conversation, because it's part of communicating to someone why you're not building something or why you are building something. And again, it gets back to sequencing the work. It also helps to flush out differences in understanding of a desired end state. So if two individuals are thinking about things very differently, and one thinks that it's a very large effort and the other one thinks that's small, you're going to have very different estimates. And again, I'm not talking about estimates, it's a swag, and it drives the conversation. Why do you feel that this is so big? I feel it's so small. Let's make sure we're aligned on the right solution. So I would say, don't strive for precision. Don't prep for estimates. Just have that conversation and see if we're making the right trade-offs and are we building the same thing. Focus all efforts on getting back to development and building features, and be really careful about that cultural slippery slope that can happen if you start to really require a higher degree of precision in estimates. So this gets to so how do startups grow into these maturing companies, and what can we learn from what can be applied to maturing products and companies and so forth from how these startups are evolving? And to me, this requires really grounding on a concept that's represented in a book called Innovator Solution by Clayton Christensen, which I have referenced many times through my career, and I would recommend that if you haven't read some of Clayton Christensen's work, you definitely do. So the basic concept of how companies grow and what happens into maturity is really what I'd like to talk about for a bit. So to help me answer some of these fundamental product questions, I step back and try and find, what is the right balance between maintaining an existing product and growth. And this obviously depends on your company and so forth, but I think Clayton Christensen offers a really nice framework for that. So here are the two books. You can take a look at them at your leisure, but at the end of the day, what Christensen is saying is that the weight of sustaining the existing business model or product can prevent maturing companies from sufficiently investing in innovative new solutions at their peril. So what I'm saying here is, when you are maturing, you have an enormous backlog. You have a ton of things that you need to do to sustain your existing business. And you have to be very careful that you focus too much on just doing these sustaining things to keep your current business functioning, and don't invest enough in those things that are truly innovative. And be wary that focusing on your needs of today can cause you to miss these big trends or these alternative solutions that ultimately will disrupt your model. They will displace you as a company. If you're completely fixated on continuing to be who you are, you will ultimately be displaced. So the product manager strategically is the one important who needs to think this through. And so startups, if you think about a startup, they have no choice. Startups they're innovative by nature. They are not maintaining anything because there is no product to maintain. They're focusing on building a new market, building a new solution, assuming that your business case is well grounded and correctly focused and so forth. You're building disruptive innovations and trying to secure a space. A maturing company will feel the weight of the backlog. And as a result, they get pulled toward these sustaining innovations or maintenance work. So the maturing company needs to be thinking about how much they're going to budget to balance the two. And that budget and guidelines to the team need to really dictate what you're going to do when, and be prepared. Really, the solution to this, as difficult it is, you need to be prepared to disrupt yourself. And that may mean that you're building a solution that is planned to replace your existing solution in the future, prior life, desktop software being displaced by online software. Lived that was not fun, but you have to go through that, and you have to be looking for ways to displace what you're building today. So with that, all this has probably gotten your head spinning. You're thinking, oh, this is academic, and hopefully some of it's intuitive and so forth. But it's because this is a really difficult job, and product management sitting right in the middle of all this, and the future of the company sits on your shoulders. You're making these trade-off decisions. You're dealing with the stresses and the strains of the decisions and the growth of the business and so forth. That can create this feeling of inadequacy because you're having to say no, you're not building enough, you're running fast, not doing everything. And so over the years, I've come up with this parable, if you will, that I've used to help my product managers think through this. And first, to those leaders out there, the pressure is real. I've had, as a director in the past, I've had people who've gotten hives from the pressure. I've had people throw up, cry. I've had everything. This is a very, very stressful job, and it does create a real sense of pressure and strain and so forth. So to me, in this parable, so the imagery that I'd like to set for this to help you as you're leading your product managers, or if you're a product manager, to think about where you are in the space and so forth. Visualize, if you will, that we're in say the 1890s, the Wild Wild West, and kind of that era. And you have an individual, let's say it's kind of the product manager persona, and I'm going to call it a PT. Let's just call him PT for now, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But let's just say that he's sitting by this river, and he's off work, and he's fishing, and there's a beautiful river here. And someone comes up to him. Let's say that it's a guy that needs to get across this river, who's well dressed and really has no opportunity to go up and around because there's a cliff, and cannot just wade through this, needs a mechanism to get over this river, and says to this person, PT, how am I going to do this? How do I get over this? And PT says, all right, let's figure this out. And he goes over and he picks up one of these massive boulders, unbelievable, probably the weight of a small car, and picks it up and throws it into the middle of the river. Nobody's ever done this before. It's unhuman. It's Herculean. And then picks up two other boulders and jumps to the first boulder, throws the first one over, jumps to the next boulder, throws it over, and now has a footbridge with rocks. Nothing could be done like this. It was like out of a Marvel movie, if you will. And the guy passes through and gets over, and all is well. So then, sometime in the future, the guy's down there, he's fishing again, and someone else comes over, and maybe they're with their family and they need to get across this river, and the rock bridge is not going to work because potentially the children could fall in. They need something a little bit safer. So he takes out his pocket knife and he cuts down the sequoia. No, it's impossible. How could he possibly do that? Picks up the tree, throws it over the river, whittles it down so that it's nice and smooth, and the family walks across. And then in the future, someone else comes and they're trying to get across, and they see this log, and that's great, but that's not going to do it because they're in a carriage. So they need to get across this river. And so we whittled this thing into a bridge, rocket speed, and the bridge is now formed in this base format to allow a carriage to get across and the person gets over. So years pass and the river rises, maybe the water gets diverted, and fishermen come and they're fishing, their boats around on either side, and the water starts to rise up, pushes this kind of makeshift bridge up and so forth. And it's, the people all over it, and it's doing its job, but it's not great. So you have the surveyor that's coming across, and they come to this bridge and they say, well, who's the idiot that built this bridge in the water? It's clearly not functional. Why didn't they build a bridge that has a drawbridge so that clearly these boats should be able to go through? And why wasn't it built wide enough so that a car could drive, because we have cars now, right? And so the moral of the story, the point of the story is really that you got to do your best. This is a bridge. The story is really a bridge, in that the bridge is both the product and the PT is the product team. They're building solutions based on what they have today. And you have to do the best that you can to solve the problems that are today for real people, and get going and do it today. You can't do it all, so do what you can today. Get started, make progress, evolve over time. Get comfortable saying, no, I didn't put this into the parable, but that's part of your job. You have to be able to say no at times and deal with that. And sometimes the miraculous things that you do and your team does just will look foolish in the future, and you're just going to have to thicken your skin. It's just part of the job. So take pride in what you accomplish, even when you hear crickets or maybe some dissent. And don't forget really about culture, because culture is impacted by what you do. If you stress too much on perfection, if you stress too much on delivery dates, as leaders, we have this ability to impact others around us. And we create a culture, whether we know it or not, by the processes that we implement. And so I would encourage you to think about things in terms of these real world, and I would call them natural laws, about the trade-offs we ask our teams to make, because they will have to make them. And it's between velocity and predictability. If you want them to run fast, don't expect them to tell you when they're going to do it. If you want them to give you super precise dates, don't expect them to run fast, because they have to slow down to get there. If they're building out a solution, there is a natural balance between form and function. And as you mature, yes, you have to solve for both. But if you want to move fast, you got to build the core function first. And thinking about things in terms of what is your objective for today and what the company needs to do today helps you make those decisions about, do I need to be perfect in my form and function, or can I have enough to prove the business model, get your A round, get your B round, get your C round, get customers, and claim a market? And so as leaders, I would encourage everyone to think about how those trade-offs affect culture. And with that, I'm going to pause and stop rambling and open it up to questions or comments, or if you disagree with me completely, that's fine too.
Fantastic. There is one question from, and if anybody else has a question, feel free to post that into the Q&A or the chat. But there was one question from Deborah. How do we help a mature company exit that cycle of asking for more and more predictability at the swag level and thus slowing everything down with fear?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So I think the maturing company just has to start by realizing that predictability is a fallacy. It is a fallacy, because to have perfect precision, you basically have to be in the project. And when you're evaluating a roadmap or you're looking at your backlog, by nature, you have not spent the time to think through all of those things. So we have to be comfortable, candidly, having the conversations with managers and executives and so forth to say, that is not what I'm trying to do here. I am not trying to predict when something can be delivered. I'm trying to make the right decision on how to sequence the work so that we move the business the way we need to move it. So I think it ultimately comes down to a candid conversation and some realization by execs, my peers, and I have to have these conversations as well, just to set realistic expectations.
Yeah, reminds me of the, I'm sure you've seen it, but the now, next, later roadmap. And I appreciate the genius behind it of like having no dates. It's like, this is what I'm working on now,
Right.
this is what I'm going to do next, this is what I'll do later. I appreciate the genius of having no dates, but I'm not sure the practicability of being able to actually use that when people want to know dates and timelines. But yeah.
So that was actually a section that I was going to present in this session that I cut out, because for me, this is also key to the entire process. When I roadmap, I use now, soon, later. And when I triage backlogs, I partition things. I'll tell you really quickly how I do it. There's now, things that the team's working on right now, that if something new comes in, yeah, you could actually pull something out of the now, put it in because it's so critical, you have to do it now. And I try and target less than 1% of the things, maybe 0.1% of the things you triage. So that's your now bucket. Then you have next. You've also invested a lot of time in next because you're planning, you're prepped. So you shouldn't have more than maybe 1% of the things you triage ever go into next because you've already thought about it. Then you have your soon, you have your later, and you have a maybe someday. And your maybe someday is basically your backlog. So when you're triaging new things, almost everything should go into soon, later, or maybe someday, and put as many into never as possible. And that's how I do it. And so then from a product management, roadmap planning perspective, on a quarterly basis or a semi-annual basis, it's the product manager's job to go back through the maybe some days, because the sooner and later are already kind of in planning. And that's going to be a large growing list. What I've always asked my product managers to do is to quartile it. So you have a top quartile of your backlog, which are things that are candidates, and you try and keep them moderately force ranked. And you have your other 3 quartiles that are buckets. And they're unprioritized. You just leave them in the bucket, but they're relatively ranked. And on a quarterly basis, you got to, or at least semi-annual, you got to go through that, make sure things are aligned, and use Kanban to pull things out of your first quartile into your soon later. And that's basically how you plan.
Nice. Yeah, that one. And that, for some people, it might even be a monthly rhythm as well, right? Yeah.
So the monthly, that's to me more of the sooner later, because those are the things you've already identified they're coming soon. They're in that month-ish, quarter-ish time frame. The backlog, the stress, the strain of the role is in the maybe some days. You're going to have hundreds, thousands. I had 4,000 backlog items when I was at Sage. But you have to quartile it and try and touch as few times as possible. That's a mantra that everyone should have. How do I touch as few times as possible? So you got to think when you triage, put it into a bucket where it can sit there reasonably and not feel anxiety about not doing something you have to.
Smart. Question from Neil. What would you say to do if there is a strong focus on precision / perfect product from the CEO?
Yeah, that's a tough one because you have a CEO that doesn't understand product management. That's the bottom line. They have never walked in your shoes. And so somehow you have to have a conversation about these trade-offs. You have to get them there. They need to understand, put it in their speak. You have to be able to say, my assumption is that you want me to run as fast as possible. And for me to run as fast as possible, I can't give you a high level of precision, because to give you a high level of precision, I have to know all this stuff. And I don't know all that stuff yet. And just help them understand. I could stop and I could spend the next quarter thinking about how long it's going to take this to build it over the next quarter, or I can get building it now. It's just a difficult conversation you have to have.
Okay. Well, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much for that today. I think there was good engagement in the chat. I think people really got a lot out of that. I particularly enjoyed your takeaways. PM is a hard job, and this is ProductCamp is my annual reminder that this is true, and we are not alone. So thank you for your session today. And everybody, I think we'll just bounce right into the final giveaway session before we do some end of camp networking. So thank you again, Steve.
Sounds good.
You can stop the broadcast now. Thanks.
Bye.